paperback and e-readers this March. John Haynes, the man with nothing to lose. The man who rules the world runs into the irresistible force of a man with nothing to lose in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get the regular and variant cover editions of John Haynes, the man with nothing to lose this March. 2 weeks ago, the comic book world was shook when AT&T decided to fire Dan Didio as co-publisher at DC Comics. But now, after I read a Bleeding Fool article, I see that there is no hope of change at DC Comics because instead of getting a qualified publishing professional to fix DC Comics' numerous issues, they have decided to make Jim Lee the sole publisher at DC Comics. Now, I find this decision to be quite troubling because your Jim Lee clearly is not qualified to run DC Comics because your Jim Lee ran his own publishing imprint, Wildstorm, into bankruptcy. And in addition to your Jim Lee running Wildstorm into bankruptcy, your Jim Lee is talking about how he wants to make DC Comics all about diversity and inclusion. And when I hear the term diversity and inclusion, it's something that really makes me nervous as a black man because oftentimes whenever people make so-called diverse and inclusive characters in comics like Marvel did with its all-new, all-different Marvel, we don't get rich multidimensional characters that give us a bigger picture of our world. Usually what we get are tokenized characters who are about promoting old stereotypes and promoting ideas that perpetuate old stereotypes to readers. And when I look at this decision by Jim Lee to talk about diversity and inclusion, I see it as an extremely disingenuous one because oftentimes, again, these comic publishers love to talk about diversity and inclusion, but when I look at who is working behind the scenes at many of these comic publishers, I don't see many black artists and writers like myself working behind the scenes. So all of this talk about diversity and inclusion is not really a genuine statement because if DC Comics was really serious about diversity and inclusion, it would be looking at the portfolios of writers like myself and looking at the portfolios of artists out here who are doing Kickstarters right now, qualified black talent and qualified diverse talent of color, and making an effort to reach out to that talent to work on their projects. But in the comic book industry, there has not been a serious effort to reach out to black writers like myself and try to make us offers to work on DC projects or properties because I have been writing and blogging for over 10 years, and while I've been doing this for over the past decade, you'll hear many in the comic book industry saying, "Oh, we will find you." Well, again, I have been here for over 10 years, and I have never heard anything from anyone at DC Comics, Marvel Comics, Boom Studios. Dynamite Comics did reach me on Twitter and asked me to send them a letter, but every other publisher has not made any effort at all to contact me at all regarding any sort of writing job, which shows me, again, the comic book industry is not very genuine about bringing in new qualified talent and talking about promoting actual diversity behind the scenes. And the reason why they don't want to promote diversity behind the scenes is because oftentimes companies like DC Comics don't want to hear opposing viewpoints to their narrative because black writers like myself, when we go out here and promote work like I do with the John Haynes series and the ISIS series and the E-Steam series, when I present black characters, I present a completely different narrative than the mainstream one. And that's one of the reasons why they're not really serious about diversity, is because they've already made up their mind to what type of narratives they want to see about the black image, and what type of stories they want to hear about the black experience. They don't really want to get a diversity of thought as related to the stories in DC Comics. No, what they want to do is give you a narrative that they feel comfortable about seeing as related to black characters and characters of color. And usually, again, they only want to see certain stereotypes because oftentimes whenever a black character or a character of color starts to become popular, it seems like your DC Comics, in their so-called push for diversity, try to find some way to bury that character or sabotage that character's growth. For example, with the character of Ryan Choi, when he took over the role of the Atom from Ray Palmer, your Ryan Choi was starting to become extremely popular. And just as the character was starting to build momentum, what did your DC Comics do? They had Deathstroke the Terminator murder Ryan Choi, cutting off all of his momentum and alienating a strong character fan base that would have probably supported the character for years. The same thing happened to Static just as he was starting to get popular with the show Static Shock. Static Shock was the #1 TV show on Kids WB. However, DC Comics and Warner Brothers didn't want Static becoming as popular as Superman and Batman and becoming a household name. So, passive-aggressively, they found ways to bury the character by not releasing his DVDs at the height of his popularity in box sets, nor did they go out of their way to merchandise the character regularly to capitalize on the character's popularity. I mean, I found it interesting that Jackie Chan Adventures got a action figure deal. I found it interesting that all of the other Warner Brothers shows, no matter how poorly they performed, got merchandising deals, but Static Shock never got a merchandising deal. And again, that was all about keeping a black character from becoming a household name because they did not want to see a black character become something popular in the eyes of white and non-black children, because they know if that character became popular in their eyes, they would see that character as a human being, and they would connect with that character the same way they want people to connect and resonate with Superman and Batman. And in addition to that character, there were other characters they have gone out of their way to sabotage, like your Mr. Terrific, Michael Holt, who was very popular because he earned the position of Mr. Terrific from the previous Mr. Terrific and had practically become a fan favorite in the comics. Now, in Justice Society of America, the black Mr. Terrific, Michael Holt, was one of the most popular characters in the DC universe. However, when it came time for Michael Holt to come to television, instead of us getting the heterosexual Michael Holt, who was from the comic books, your Greg Berlanti decided to turn Mr. Terrific into a homosexual character, and on top of it, he decided to turn him into a bumbling, stumbling idiot. So the confident, self-assured, heterosexual, masculine Michael Holt from the comics, he was turned into a neutered, emasculated beta male, all because your DC Comics, while they were passively promoting diversity, wanted to aggressively find a way to degrade the character so he would not become more popular than Oliver Queen, the white male lead character. And the same thing is happening on Batwoman right now with the Luke Fox character, who again, in the DC Comics, is a strong, confident, heterosexual black man, but on the Batwoman show, he has been reduced to a bumbling, stumbling, buck-dancing butler, and as a bumbling, stumbling, buck-dancing butler, he is presented in a role that makes the Kate Kane character appear to be more than she is, and appear to be the more competent person in the relationship. And again, this is the type of diversity that your Jim Lee wants to probably promote at DC Comics, and that's not diversity at all. When you think of actual diversity, you think of diversity of thought, diversity of viewpoints, diversity of ideas, something that we got with Marv Wolfman's New Teen Titans when he introduced Victor Stone, the cyborg, a character who, while he presented a concept of being an angry black man, gave us rich depth and dimension as related to showing why Victor was angry and why he had issues with his family. And he had those issues because his family didn't treat him like a person. It treated him like a lab experiment. And this is the thing that led to him having issues with his family, and the thing that led to him having a rift between himself and his father. And while we were getting Cyborg, we got a strong, confident man from a two-parent household, a man who wanted to show how human he was and how he could contribute to the team, and showed how he could contribute to the team, because with Cyborg we got to see all of that richness and multidimensionality as related to a character. And while we got a black hero, we got lots of diversity of thought, diversity of ideas. We saw the contrast between Victor and his family, the contrast between his viewpoints of the world, and we're not getting that diversity these days with a lot of these token diversity characters who basically are just reskinned versions of the white characters, and with a few ethnicity token points added to them. This is the big problem with your so-called diversity pushes, is that we don't get much diversity of thought, because oftentimes people like Jim Lee don't really understand, don't want to bring in talent like myself to bring in that diversity of thought, that diversity of viewpoints, diversity of opinions. That's something we're not getting from DC Comics, and that's why I say they're extremely disingenuous when they talk about trying to bring in so-called diversity and inclusion, because there's no effort to include qualified black writers, no efforts to include qualified black artists, and no efforts to include qualified black editors to oversee DC Comics and bring actual diversity of thought to DC Comics. No, oftentimes with these companies, we get a lot of white people at the top of these companies, but no efforts to hire any sort of black talent in any way, shape, or form. So when I hear Jim Lee talking about diversity at DC Comics and him still being in charge of DC Comics after mismanaging Wildstorm years ago and DC Comics being a complete disaster under his leadership, all it shows me is that there is no hope of any change at DC Comics, and it would be better for comic fans to spend their money on books like I produce at the SJS Direct imprint, or books from indie publishers like those who have Kickstarters and Indiegogos. So if you really want really good comics, you don't need to go over to the big two, Marvel Comics or DC Comics, because they really don't respect the customer, and they aren't really interested in giving the customer quality stories that show us great content as related to the character. And it's just time for comic fans to move on to independent publishers like the SJS Direct imprint and many of the indie comic publishers like those who are running Kickstarters and Indiegogos, because the only way we are going to get change in the comic book industry is if we vote with our dollars and we vote with our wallets and walk over to those who are interested in giving us great comics and great stories, because that's the only way we're going to get great comics and great stories, is if we support the publishers who go out of their way to give us their very best and want to give us our very best. Because it's clear to me that Jim Lee has no interest in giving us anything that's good, and it's clear to me that DC Comics, because there is no hope and no change, is going to continue on a state of decline to the point where it's eventually going to crash and burn and take the current comic book industry right along with it. So if you want to pick up some of my SJS Direct publications like the ISIS series, the East Dean series, the John Haynes series, or books like the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com, and where you can get those books in paperback and Kindle formats. And if you want to see me make more videos about comics, comic reviews, or go to comic conventions and make vlogs, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.